Welcome to Arundel House this morning. My name is James Hackett. I'm editor of the Military Balance here at IISS. Really pleased to welcome back to the Institute Professor Des Roches from the Near East South Asia Centre at the National Defence University in Washington DC, formerly Director of Arabian Peninsula Policy in OSD, and worked with the DSCA, serving military officer, and a published historian. Dave will talk to us about Saudi Arabia's defence reform in the West, covering issues as varied as Vision 2030, the Kingdom's aspiration for its defence reform, and Western defence relations. We'll speak for about 20-25 minutes. This is on the record, and then we can go into Q&A. Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I am speaking on the record, so I do have to let everybody know, though, that my views are only my own. They do not reflect the views or agency of any U.S. government body, and I left government in I can't even recall. It's about 6 years ago, and my blood pressure dropped about 15 points. And I have not looked at a classified document since then. And honestly, I don't think I'm missing out on a whole lot. But if you cite me, don't cite me as having access to the latest inside knowledge, because I don't pretend to have that. And if you want to, if you decide you do want to cite me, my contact information's up there. And if you send me I'm not as articulate as I want to be from time to time, so I'd appreciate the opportunity to maybe refine my remarks a little bit, but I'll happily address anything I talk here. Let me start with one key caveat, which is, as a military officer, we have this phenomenon in the U.S. Army called OC syndrome. The United States Army reinvented itself after the Vietnam era by establishing the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. It's adjacent to Death Valley, halfway between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. It is the only fort in the U.S. Army that was originally built to house prisoners of war, for reasons that are immediately obvious to anybody who's ever visited the place. And what we do is we brought units out there to do force-on-force exercises. And the people who actually monitor and evaluate it are called the observer controllers, or OCs. And I've been an OC myself, and a lot of my friends have done it. And what you notice is that once they've been there about a week and a half, you say, "So, how are the units coming through?" And they all say the same thing, which is, "It is a miracle we are not speaking Russian." Every unit that comes through is screwed up. Nobody in the U.S. Army knows how to put their boots on the right foot. This is obvious. And so military officers tend to be very hard on other things. And so I'm going to speak openly about Saudi Arabia, but my remarks do not come from a place of love, but they do come from a place of respect. And I recognize the importance of this undertaking. It is not helpful to anybody to have dysfunctional Saudi Arabia. And to have an efficient Saudi defense infrastructure that meets its national needs, is consistent with the national security needs of the United States and national security needs of Great Britain. So I'm going to speak frankly, and I just don't want anybody to misconstrue where I come from. I greatly value the time I spend with the Saudi security forces, and do a lot of work with them, and look forward to doing a lot more work with them as long as we can help each other out. So the first thing I want to talk about is how much money is spent on this. I know that in just talking to some of you, and I appreciate you all coming out today, that a lot of you are out of the business world, and Saudi Arabia is the top line. They spend about $60 billion a year on military spending. The other countries are the UAE and Iran, and a lot of analysis of Gulf militaries does not come from a place of love, to put it. People start talking about Western analysts of Arab militaries, and they instantly start channeling their inner Edward Said, and I don't think that's necessarily valid, but I do want to point out to you that there is a reason why Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar spend more money on their defense infrastructure than Iran. And it's not necessarily because they're bad people or they're lazy or there's corruption. It's because they have different strategic goals. And this is my opportunity to promote this short pamphlet I've written, which I've got 6 copies here, and it's available on the web, that describes the strategic asymmetry between the two. Basically, Saudi Arabia has to ensure dominance of the region to achieve their security goals, and Iran just has to have the ability to disrupt it. Dominance is expensive, disruption is cheap. And there, I just saved you 17 minutes of tough reading. So there you have it. Now, of course, what people focus on are defense imports. This chart comes from Jane's, which typically the way I operate is I kind of know from my career in the Pentagon what I know, and then I will tell an intern, okay, this is what I want something to prove, and then he comes back with something from Jane's. So if you want to be roughly on a par with where people are in the Pentagon, look at Jane's. And what you see is that most of the imports comes from the United States. Canada is significant, along with France. With Canada, it's mostly armored vehicles, the LMTVs that are used by the National Guard. A little well known, Canada provides all the 5-gallon water jugs used by the U.S. military. And so I assume, 5-gallon water jugs are an important commodity in Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, the United Kingdom up here, and you guys know what you produce better than that. This is a lot of money. There is one distinct difference, though. Even though the United States is the largest provider, we are pretty much the only country that does not have an impetus to export weapons, an economic impetus. We can generally satisfy the acquisition requirements of our own armed forces without exporting weapons. The Swedes cannot afford to develop a new aircraft if they don't export. Their air force is too small. So all these other countries have to export. We do not. And indeed, until Donald Trump took over, and I've said this a few times, people just don't believe it. Sometimes I've made the same point to the same group, and every year they ask me the same questions. But the bureaucrats in the United States government, which is less joined up than British government, this is normally when British government people snort derisively, the bureaucrats who are responsible for selling weapons have no responsibility for maintaining the defense industrial base. They are only joined up at the Deputy Secretary of Defense level. And so what that means is that until Donald Trump's administration, if there was an issue of selling weapons to any country in the world, we did not consider the defense industrial base. The only time those considerations came into play was if we were sure they were going to buy something and the production line was about to go cold. And so we're like, look, you're going to buy this. If you don't buy it now, once the line goes cold, it's going to cost you a lot more money to restart the line and do it. That's the only time we do it. Now, Trump has changed that and said you need to take into account the economic impact on that. That's kind of changed the rules a little bit, and the problem, of course, is how do you balance that? It seems somewhat like a blank check, but that's still being worked out. So what does Saudi Arabia get for all this money? Again, this is from Jane's, and they assess key areas of the military, and it's actually a fairly optimistic assessment for the air-based forces. I dispute this. They say that they're medium on ground-based air defense. Let's see if I can't get the pointer anymore. But basically, ground-based air defense. I think that actually in terms of ground-based air defense, the Saudi armed forces are one of the most proficient forces in the world. They have an incredible rate of success with shoot-down of missiles coming in. And contrary to what people think, normally air defense is the most mechanical of military services. You're basically setting up a weapon system and operating that weapon system. You follow a manual, you follow defined procedures. The reaction times are so short that you don't really have room to improvise or to exert qualities of leadership. It's a technical thing. But the Saudis have actually departed upward from the manual, adopted and improved on U.S. Army doctrine. And let me tell you, that is an action of political significant courage, where for 2 generations people have been told this is the American way, do it as faithfully as possible and you can't go wrong. And they've actually said, no, we can make it better. There's been improvisation, which a lot of traditional outside observers of Arab militaries say Arab militaries are incapable of doing. There has been improvisation and adaptation, modifying command procedures, introducing redundancy into missile battery command and controls, things of that nature. So I would argue that by and large this is pretty much right, except for in air defense. I think they're actually better than Jane's assesses them as. And I can tell you, when I make this point in the Washington think tank community, it's as if I described seeing a Sasquatch running down Pennsylvania Avenue, because the ingrained assumption of inefficiency is so strong that to find somebody who says other than that, the assumption is automatically that I'm on the payroll or being dishonest or something like that. But it's true, and I'd be happy to address that in questions. So why do they get so little bang for the buck? Well, the first reason is that they weren't necessarily formed and built with the idea of developing military efficiency. Does anybody recognize these two gentlemen?
7 days in May.
Yeah, that's right. 7 days in May. So I wanted to show an illustration of a coup, and I wanted to do it in a way that shows that this is a universal thing. So 7 Days in May, this was the 1960s movie, Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas. It's about a military coup in the United States. And what, of course, I find interesting is the coup was led by an Air Force general, which... the United States has, our position in the world has steadily declined since we formed an independent Air Force. As I said, I don't speak for the United States government. Coup-proofing is a concept that was originally introduced in a RAND Corporation paper in the late 90s, and people have taken to it the idea that you have redundant security institutions that are there to keep an eye on each other. Actually, in my MA thesis that I wrote at SOAS, I did it on Saddam Hussein before he invaded Kuwait. I was a little bit ahead of my time, and I pointed out that he's done the same thing, but I didn't get the turn of phrase, and of course the fact that I was an illiterate, beer-swilling student instead of a scholar focused on publication and dissemination ensured that I didn't get credit for the turn of phrase. But so the big example people look at here with Saudi Arabia is, of course, the presence of two land armies, the National Guard and the land forces. They are more or less similar. The National Guard is a motorized infantry force that doesn't have heavy armor, doesn't have artillery, is only recently introducing an aviation wing. The Saudi land forces are a mechanized force, are a armored force. So they have heavy capabilities, they have tanks, they have armored fighting vehicles, they have heavy artillery, they have the full range, they're capable of full spectrum warfare. And then of course you have the Ministry of the Interior, which has certain elements within it. It's standing up a special operations unit. They're actually sending guys to SEAL school and Ranger school. It's developing an aviation unit. So you have multiple security forces. So that's one coup-proofing. The second explanation is the more common one of culture. And Kenneth Pollack is currently the lead advocate on that. I was just at a conference last week, and I heard Kenneth being called all sorts of horrible names. I don't know the guy. I haven't met him. I would say that he is Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog. So I read his PhD dissertation, and the main points in it are the same as his most recent book, which just came out last year, and that is that there's a dysfunctional culture. If you look at him speak, he's at pain to say he doesn't mean Arab culture or Islamic culture. He means things like the idea that you get your driver's license when you turn 16, this idea of viewing an engineer as a problem solver and as a model to aspire to, those sorts of things. So it's more social culture, and I think that people who dismiss him as a Westerner are doing themselves a disservice. And he, if you go on YouTube, he gave a talk at the Westminster Institute that I think is a good explanation of it. But there is this idea of a dysfunctional culture, and usually when you go into this, what you find is that there are people talk about the discouragement of initiative, the fact that people in a position of authority don't take suggestions from people who are not in a position of authority, that there's a discouragement of innovation and things of that nature. And as I pointed out, that is changing, at least in certain pockets of excellence, most notably the Saudi Air Defense Forces. But it is hard, and I run a lot of events with Saudi military officers, and sometimes, first off, they always sit in hierarchy according to rank, and everybody knows their date of rank. So there's a junior brigadier general will sit to the side of the senior brigadier general because they know their dates of rank. And when questions are asked, it's a very rare Saudi leader who has the junior officers ask the questions. Sometimes the senior officer will ask the questions. And if the senior officer is a smoker, he will ask one question, then he'll say no more questions because he wants to go out and have smoke. So that is an issue, and it's still persistent, and it does inhibit a lot of any Army officer who has served in combat will tell you that junior leaders generally come up with the best ideas when you're in extremis. It's very rare that the right solution is passed down from the top. Other factors as well, the tradition of Egyptian education that focuses on memorization and things like that. And then finally, the third idea is the glitter factor. The glitter factor refers to the idea that people view defense capacity as just a process of buying weapons. If you have the latest weapons, you have the best weapons. If you have the best weapons, you have the best army, QED. And of course, what you wind up with are people who don't know how to use their weapons. They don't know how to support them. They don't have the pipeline to keep, Patriot crew members coming in, things of that nature. So those are the three traditionally cited ones. Now, how is Saudi Arabia dealing with this? Well, the first thing is they're modifying their Ministry of Defense in a way that, quite frankly, I wish the United States would do. What they've done is they're dividing it in between doers and enablers. And so in the past, the Ministry of Defense was more or less personal office. By the way, if you want to email me, I'll send you all these slides. So what you've got is basically a policy and enabling branch on the left, the Minister for Strategic Affairs. Then centers of excellence. These are enabling things like IT, finance, human resources. So this would be J1, J7, J9. And then procurement and armaments. So direct, enable, acquire. Then you have the forces. There's a study underway that is considering combining the Saudi Air Defense Forces with the Saudi Air Force. The separate air defense forces is a structure you usually find in the former Soviet Union, Egypt. It creates problems just in terms of interaction. So, for example, the head of the Saudi Air Defense Forces is the head of a military service on a par with the Chief Staff of the United States Army. And so when he comes for a counterpart visit, he says, all right, I'm here for my counterpart visit. And the Chief Staff of the United States Army has a limited protocol budget and says, we've already had a Saudi visit. I said, who was that from? The head of the Saudi National Guard. Oh, okay. Well, you've got the Air Defense Forces, and you've got the head of the Saudi Army coming. They're also counterpart visits. And the bureaucracy just finds it so hard to deal with three forces. And literally the counterpart for the Saudi Air Defense Forces of the United States is the Deputy Commander of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the Center of Fires is located, Center of Fires Excellence. So that's just the bureaucratic problems. When a letter is sent, it goes down to a major general instead of going directly to the Chief of Staff of the Army. The second problem is just in terms of how do you fight the air defense battle. If all you are doing is hitting missiles that come in and taking them down, first off, the missiles coming at you cost $400,000. You're firing two $4.3 million Patriot missiles at them. So that's $8.6 million to $400,000. So it's like somebody's trying to break your window by throwing rocks at them, and you're knocking the rocks out of the air by throwing Krugerrands at them. It's not sustainable in the long run. But the other thing is you have to have an element of deterrence. Ideally, you want the shared feed coming in, so the same feed that projects where the missile is goes to the defense batteries and goes to attack assets that attack the point of origin instantaneously. And that's how most NATO countries are trying to operate their air defense. It generally has to be integrated. And if you have a separate service, inevitably you introduce friction, things like that. So the services move this way. And then, finally, and this is what's really interesting, a standing joint forces commander. This is along the British model of PJHQ. In the past, when you've had Saudis in action, they have either operated as individual services or there's been an ad hoc commander appointed. He doesn't have an existing staff. And so things like cross-service logistics, particularly when one service has French rifles and one service, or Belgian rifles, one service has. Those just confound them to the end, and they have to solve the problem by bringing in contractors and extraordinary means. But if you have a standard joint forces command that is joint from day one, then those problems are more easily dealt with. And really what this reflects, the United States, we have them on geographical locations. So we have one for European Command, one for Central Command. They're smaller countries, so they're going to recognize, okay, we only need one, like the United Kingdom does, and this is going to be it. And this is, the Germans run the same way with their headquarters in Potsdam. So this is, I think, a really good move forward. And this is probably the most revolutionary change that we'll see in Saudi defense reform. Now, the United States, Britain, other interested countries are committed to helping out across the range on this through education, advisors, training, things of that nature, because we recognize it's in our nature, or in our interest rather. It is in our interest to have a strong, capable, competent Saudi Arabia that can achieve its security goals in a timely manner. Again, I'm saying I haven't said we're doing this for money. I haven't said we're doing this for sales. I haven't said we're doing this because we want to control oil. It is in our interest to have them meet their security challenges in a competent and effective manner. I'm saying that as a jingoistic American and a graduate of London University, as you can tell by the accent. So, on the reform. GAMI. This is also revolutionary. GAMI is designed to basically be, it's almost on a French dirigiste model, sort of a super champion of logistics combined with like Undersecretary of Defense for Technology, Logistics, Acquisition. So it should vet, define, requirements, encourage standardization. I think there's something like 9 rifles in use across the Saudi Armed Forces right now. Some are German, some are Belgian, some are American. You can imagine the nightmare of spare parts, the nightmare of just ensuring a standard round. So GAMI will say, right, everybody's going to have the same boots, everybody's going to have the same rifle, unless there is a need for that. They vet that. They also coordinate some of the acquisition and the offset requirements. So GAMI is a huge organization. It is consonant with the Vision 2030 goals, which is an experiment in government engineering on the likes of which we very rarely see. This is like Ataturk. Transforming Turkey. And so it's a technocratic ministry as far as I can tell. Even if they make the wrong decisions, a lot of times being standardized around the wrong thing is probably more efficient than having this diversity of unsupportable systems that just can't be modified. An 80% solution that's standardized is probably better than pockets of 100% solution and 60% solution that can't be sustained and supported across the board. So I think GAMI is a good idea. And then subordinate to that, or working along with it, is SAMI, Saudi Arabian Military Industries. This is a commercial military function that has very ambitious goals. But they're setting up joint ventures. They're ensuring that military production is to be conducted in Saudi Arabia. And the Vision 2030 goals are that by 2030, 50% of all defense acquisitions will be locally produced. Now, I asked some questions about that to the then director at the time, Andrew Schwerner, who came from Rheinmetall, and he was very ambitious. He said, we want technology transfer, we're going to produce stuff, and we're going to export stuff. And that's not consistent with U.S. arms export technology. Normally, any objective observer would say the United States doesn't sell weapons. We actually lease them because they come with such conditions that they're really not fully owned. And so I said, this is going to be hard. And then the other thing, of course, is it's going to be so expensive to do this. And the response I got back was, the 50% requirement is by dollar. So as long as it is grossly expensive to produce items in Saudi Arabia, they can meet their targets. They just have to, it's kind of like designing the world's heaviest airplane. But they're not stupid. They're aware of this. They think that it is in their strategic interest to pay extra money to develop domestic production of weapons. And I think part of that, this is where security interests get subordinated to overall cultural interests, which is we will pay a premium on our defense acquisition, which, let's face it, is entirely controlled by the government. They can turn it on and off like a tap, in order to further our goal of a cultural transformation of Saudi Arabia from a rentier state where all wealth flows from the government to a state that's based upon people going to work every day in the private sector. They are willing to pay a premium for that. So the security interest is subordinated with the cultural interest. And honestly, I think that's a laudable goal. And they're literally putting their money where their mouth is. Now, what's the problems with these plans? The first one is the war in Yemen. I Googled for an image of Yemen destruction and desolation, and this is one of the first 3 I came up with. The war in Yemen has been a disaster for the interests of Saudi Arabia, and it has been a disaster for relations of Saudi Arabia with its traditional defense partners in the West. And it's, we all know why. It's unpopular, it's inconclusive, it's a humanitarian disaster. It's seen as being enabled by us collectively, U.S., Britain, Canada, Germany, Belgium, everybody who supplies weapons is seen as implicit in what is a huge ongoing humanitarian crisis. And we've seen countries that have withdrawn. The United Kingdom has said these further sales are illegal. There's bills being introduced in the United States Congress that cut off weapons supplies. And I will return to those in a moment. They're not going anywhere, but it gets bigger and bigger. And every time there is an airstrike that hits, school children or whatever, the opposition in the West mounts. And I've argued, if you go on YouTube and look for me, Yemen War, literally the day after the bombing started, I was on C-SPAN and I made the case that a war conducted from the air inevitably will kill people, and if you don't, that you don't want to kill. And if the war drags on, that not only will they not achieve their goals, it will become counterproductive over time. I wish I had been wrong, but I lived through Kosovo. This is what NATO did in Kosovo over 2 years instead of 90 days. We start off with Wes Clark telling us confidently that we will only hit the Ministry of the Interior troops that are involved in human rights damage and leave the Yugoslavian army next door untouched. And by 90 days later, we've destroyed the power grid in Belgrade. Every bridge over the Danube has been dropped. You just expand the target because you can never win a war exclusively from the air. That's the mistake NATO made. The Saudis, to an extent, were following NATO's example. They're in a problem here, and it has soured relations with all the traditional weapons suppliers in the West. What makes it worse is now in the age of social media and the internet, we see this stuff instantly. A logical comparison is the British reaction to Biafra. Biafra was in the 70s, horrible suffering, a partner that, was not really operating in consonance with Western values, but okay, fine. So Oberon Waugh writes an angry pamphlet, and 15 people in the London literary scene mean it. Now you can see these pictures and video every day of people dying, and Western public's much more mobilized by social media. So this is a problem for Saudi Arabia. The second problem is the death of Jamal Khashoggi, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. This is at the Arab Center, Washington D.C. Khalil Jashan, Jamal in the middle, Christian Ulrichsen, who used to run the Middle East Center here, a friend of mine, and I was on the panel. I don't have a picture of me with Jamal, I really miss it, but I was on a panel with him before that. After that, we actually went and had drinks together. He had mineral water, I had double Lagavulin. He reached for the check, and I said, no, my friend, I'm not going to allow the water drinker to subsidize the whiskey drinker. I tell this because I want to let you know I'm not in the top rank of Washington think tank personalities, but I knew him fairly well. And if I knew him, everybody knew him. Everybody knows him in Washington. And even though he was a Saudi citizen, he's considered to be an American. And the manner in which this was carried out is just abhorrent. And the fact that he was a columnist for one of the two most influential newspapers in the United States that is owned by the world's richest man who runs that newspaper as a loss leader means that this issue is not going to die. He's not going to let it die. And every 6 months the story comes up. Now there are precedents for people behaving poorly and the United States overlooking it. France bombing the Rainbow Warrior. They murdered somebody in Auckland Harbor, and then they said, well, you caught a few of our commandos, but if you incarcerate them on this island, we'll ensure they serve out their sentence. And the New Zealanders said, fine, we'll put them on the island, and then the submarine pulls up and they're off in Paris, hooching it up at the Ritz and getting awarded medals. France basically gave a big F you, and we said, well, France was important. But that was pre-social media day. And the guy who died on the Rainbow Warrior wasn't a columnist for the Washington Post that was owned by the richest man in the world. So this issue is not going to die. And honestly, I don't know a way out of this. And I don't think the Saudis do either. It's when I talk to Saudis about it, they make arguments. Ali Shahabi at the Arabia Foundation has written on this, but honestly, it's kind of like a boxer who's waiting for the referee to say that's it. They're too strong to go down, but they can't put their dukes up and just getting rocked and rolled. It's like Muhammad Ali's last 3 fights. To be honest, it's. I don't know how it's going to end, and neither does anybody else. It's not going to end anytime soon. We understand that ultimately the relationship between the West and Saudi Arabia is more important than one guy, but it can't be swept under the rug, and it's not going to be swept under the rug, and I just don't know. It's complicating everything. And finally, this guy. I must say that I'm coming to London after taking years of abuse from my British counterparts, that the idea of returning the favor in terms of a vocally undisciplined, multiple married and affairs with an unusual hairstyle running state. Coming back at you. Karma's switching from the United States to Britain. Trump is a polarizing figure. People who would do things when Barack Obama was president will not do them just to oppose Trump. I spoke in the earlier slides about the bills in the U.S. Senate restricting arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and I can tell you that there were senators who had no problem with this, no problem with the war in Yemen, as long as Barack Obama was president. And when it changed to Trump, unfortunately, opposing Saudi Arabia is becoming seen as a means of opposing Trump. Those are becoming the same way here. And what that means is that Saudi Arabia's interests are at grave risk of becoming collateral damage to the visceral like of almost everybody in the Washington policy community and legislative community for the president. So it's not really about Saudi Arabia, but it may be about Saudi Arabia. Attacking Saudi Arabia is seen as a way of attacking Trump. And that is not good for Saudi Arabia. So the Trump factor there, unfortunately, has been negative. So what's in play? These are the amount of active weapons sales, foreign military sales cases that have already been moving to Saudi Arabia. $89 billion. This is just from the United States. So there's a lot of money going here. These are cases that have already cleared. They're authorized. They're being overseen. These are the Saudi portion of the emergency cases that Secretary Mike Pompeo, my West Point classmate, also from Orange County, California. I should point out my West Point class: Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State; Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense; Joseph DePinto, President of 7-Eleven. So we will control nuclear weapons, diplomacy, and Slurpees. This is a very interesting thing. The fact that Congress was unwilling to allow these to move shows the level of frustration with Saudi Arabia, because the aircraft follow-on and support services, these are not items that you embargo, they sit in a warehouse, and then when the embargo is lifted, they shift. These are things that require significant in-country contractor presence. And some of you are in the private sector, if you've got a guy who's working a contract in Saudi Arabia, then you cancel the contract. They don't just go into suspended animation. They get another job, they go home. And when you want to restart the contract, it's going to take the better part of a year, probably more than a year, to hire people to bring them back, because people are going to get other jobs. And particularly in Saudi Arabia, where it's the environment is not seen as hospitable as it might be in some other countries. Paved way, of course, precision-guided munitions. That is right in the sweet spot of the differences between the administration and Congress. That's a precision-guided munitions. The one that is really amazing to me is this MOD transformation support. I spoke of how the Ministry of Defense is being revised. The fact that members of Congress would hold up the case to provide technical expertise for that MOD transformation shows just how deep the rancor is, and how much damage they are willing to do to Saudi interests to get back at President Trump, or because they think they've been doing this. So this is the most important. Honestly, I could make the case that we do this out of pocket. It's so important. But they're paying for it, so let them do it. And then the F-18 panels. Now, we have a lot of defense experts in the room. What is Saudi Arabia doing with F-18 panels? They do not fly the F-18. They are actually assembling them for, I believe, Kuwait, which does fly the F-18. So there already is a nascent defense production capability in Saudi Arabia. Kuwait's not big enough to operate these facilities there. Saudi Arabia can, but they're dependent on American parts, which require American dependency on that. So you actually see an enabling of the regional production and export capacity of the Saudi arm industry, which the President of the United States thought was important enough to override Senate prerogative. So the administration is very, very committed to both defense transformation and to the development of a sustainable Saudi defense industry, as I believe it should be. Going forward, first off, a lot of these sales, I think, are uncontroversial, particularly of air defense systems, and the Saudi Air Defense Forces are modernizing at a rapid clip. They're going to have eventually more THAAD, which is this system on the right here. That's the most modern. They're going to have more THAAD than the United States Army when their buys are completed. They're also, of course, going to be modernizing their Navy, and I think that when they actually have a requirements-based assessment of what they need rather than the traditional, this prince heads this service, this prince heads that service, say what you want, go to the royal court, you get the money or you don't. When they have a requirement-based thing that will be conducted under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense, we will see an increase in the Saudi Navy capacity. And I think they're already actually pretty good at minesweeping, but that's something that I think they will. It is a mystery to me that the Arab Gulf states are not among the global leaders in minesweeping, given the threat they face and the amount of resources they have. I cannot explain that. I can't explain that. And then finally, it will be joint. So these are British forces working in the field. The United States has recognized a few things. We are like key security partners and enablers of Saudi Arabia, but we're not the only ones. And I can tell you that in a lot of these things, we are committed to working with our partners and allies, to include the United Kingdom, that a lot of this business will go to the United Kingdom. We don't see it as a bad thing. In the terms of the trenchant term of Lyndon Johnson, the lazy speechwriter's best friend, would rather have you inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in. So we're aware that if the United States tries to hold off partner participation, what we'll get is this constant sniping. And so we want to go ahead in a cooperative way. And we've seen instances where unilateral approaches just have not worked, both American and other countries, because it's like being trapped on the horn of dilemma. You feel the pain of the horn, and then the attractiveness of the other horn just seems to people go back for. So it will be a cooperative thing, and I can tell you that folks who work on this, I know, are in close consultation with the Ministry of Defense here in the UK, and that there will be positions there, and that and they will not be subordinate positions across the board, that this is a true partnership. So I've spoken a lot, and I apologize for the rapidity and the slides, but I will take whatever questions you want, and this is my contact information if you want some of the slides or what have you. Thank you.
So please, if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up and state your name and affiliation. First in the first row.
Khalid Azim, Citation with News Forum. Firstly, how long do you think before the Saudi forces will be able to run their own forces? Because they say that there's a lot of talk the last couple of years that they're so dependent on UK trainers, US trainers, and the Saudis say that they do want to run their own forces. Right. And secondly, what is the situation with the nuclear? Because the Saudis have said that if the Iranians get nuclear, we're going to get nuclear.
Right.
And apparently they have been having a lot of talks with the Pakistanis. Hence, Crown Prince MBS has gone to Islamabad. He's met with Imran Khan. He's given a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Within the conditions of that, I've been told there's a lot of cooperation on nuclear.
So let me start with nuclear first, and then I'll go to training. Actually, Lincoln, when you mentioned training, you didn't mention Pakistan, which is also a huge trainer of Saudi Armed Forces. And Pakistan has a sweet spot for training in that they are a fellow Muslim nation, extremely professional military forces that are relatively highly regarded, and cheap. They're poor. So a lot of the, particularly in the Ministry of the Interior, a lot of the actual training of individual soldiers, not mentorship of generals and stuff, but a lot of the actual training is actually conducted by Pakistanis. That's kind of their sweet spot. So I think there will continue to be a resource for that, but quite frankly, a lot of the training shows the need for reform. You can talk to some units, and they've bought in extremely expensive U.S. military trainers. They pay for this stuff. And to put an American in Saudi Arabia is very expensive, and they're teaching them things like physical fitness. And, you don't need a Marine Corps colonel to show you how to do pull-ups. You can get it for something else. So I think GAMI and the ministry will rationalize a lot of that training. And I think that what they will do is look at value for money, professionalism. There will be some considerations that are outside of economics, just for maintenance of strategic ties, things of that nature. But I think that honestly, low-cost professional militaries, Jordanis, Pakistanis, things like that, will have an advantage. Nuclear. If you want to scare the heck out of people, the easiest way to do it is to use the phrase Arab and nuclear in the same paragraph. There was recently a little foofara over, there was a proposal to provide civilian nuclear power licenses to Saudi Arabia from the United States. This was, I think, a little bit over-exaggerated. Honestly, if you're concerned about Saudi Arabia acquiring a weapon, probably the least effective way of doing it would be to enter into an American commercial power licensing and then try to subvert that over a period of years. I have long said for years that Saudi Arabia already has a nuclear deterrent, it's just that it's located in Pakistan. I'm kind of half joking when I say that, but I think there is some truth to that, and you got at that point. I think also that there is, unfortunately, a political imperative that because the West recognized Iran's right to have some degree of a nuclear thing, the Saudis were, not consulted on that, and they said, well, whatever Iran gets, we want. In the past, they said that vis-a-vis Israel and didn't act on it. Now it's Iran. That's a hard argument to counter, and I don't think the West has a good response to that. I think the way the West deals with it is we say, look, you stay away from this. I didn't mention the Saudi strategic rocket forces, which are also separate forces. It's because they're kept away from the Americans. I've only met like 3 guys who have identified themselves as being a member of that in all the years I've been working this issue. They have Chinese missiles, which are a lot more compatible with Pakistani stuff. So I think what we ought to do is hug them, work with them on the civilian nuclear capacity, and hopefully they'll see the benefits of that. And they will follow their own strategic logic. But the idea of a cutoff from the West, if they meet a nuclear threshold, I think that is more damaging for them than for Iran. So I think they'll be responsible.
Gentleman in the third row, and then we'll go to the back for Emil.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Ewan Grant, I'm the former UK Customs Services intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet states.
Okay.
I've worked subsequently in law enforcement and economic projects in Yemen and in Pakistan, where I've seen the total geopolitical illiteracy of organisations like the World Bank and Western officials in the Asian development. They really just don't get the dynamics of the region and miss a hell of a lot, which impacts on their programs because they just can't understand what you're talking about. They should. That's their problem. My question is, you alluded to it in your comments about the strategic missile forces. Where do you see the West, primarily the US, taking account of a possible shift, or more likely a hedging of bets in Saudi and the Gulf to deal with the Chinese and the Russians? By the way, thank you for such a connoisseur's comment about lack of oil.
Well, I understand we understand each other. When I first came into government, I don't tell people this very often, but I was a political appointee in the Bill Clinton White House. And my responsibility was narcotics, and I was the international law enforcement analyst. And one of the highlights every month was I would get the British Customs Service Gazette, which was like an intelligence thing, but they realized that this would be read by very junior people, and it had technical information like patterns of smuggling and stuff. So they wrote it to be as funny as possible because they realized if they told people to read it, they wouldn't. So it was like funny. And the British Airways flight from Kingston to Heathrow, I remember they said, "Old Faithful," they always call that. And it was things like, if you have a guy who's unemployed and decides he's going to go on a trip to Colombia for 2 days with no source of income, he's probably a smuggling threat. So thank you for that.
They were deception measures. They were the great successes of the traffickers.
That's true.
Massacre on a grand scale.
Well, you have an adaptive enemy. So what works a week ago becomes the decoy. I agree with you. Cultural illiteracy is huge. Let me put this out to the group. What is the greatest U.S. Department of Defense training what do the Saudis ask for most training in? What subject matter are they most interested in from the U.S. Department of Defense? What would you think? Rifle marksmanship, welding, fire artillery control? It is English language training. The Saudi military alone has requested about 3 times the annual capacity of the United States Department of Defense for English language training. So what that implies to me is that, I don't want to get all Noam Chomsky on you, but cultural affinity often follows language affinity. Now, my parents are Canadian, so obviously I'm familiar with the limitations of that, but I think Saudi Arabia culturally is moving towards the West. You know, the culture is there. Cell phone penetration, social media activism, 88 channels of public TV. This is all cultural. Then you get Mohammed bin Nayef and his opening of the country and reforms. I think that helps. And inevitably, I think government will follow culture. The real impact of the Chinese, unfortunately, is political philosophy. Even during the Cold War, the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, the argument was over who can best deliver these results of, quality of life in an advanced company. There were different approaches, but we agreed on the results. What China has done is there's a different result, which is you can be rich, you can be developed, you can have high-speed rail and modern airports and all the latest conveniences and have absolutely no political participation. And indeed, all this technology can increase the ability of the state over that. And I think that the attractiveness of that model to countries in the Gulf, and Saudi Arabia is probably number 3 on the list of being attracted by that. That is the real Chinese threat. The rest of this stuff is ash and trash, honestly. When the Chinese sell weapons, it's usually something that we won't sell them, like armed drones. If we wanted to sell them armed drones, they'd buy our armed drones, but we didn't, so they bought Chinese. And I don't think that they view the Chinese model of defense as one to follow, but the political one, that's it. And we're not countering that adequately. We're not countering that. Emil.
Thank you. Emil, senior fellow for the release here at the ISS.
Thank you.
I would be two-part question. I would be curious to hear your assessment about the performance of border defense, Saudi. How much territory are they able to defend? How much Saudi territory is being penetrated?
Right.
Beyond the missiles and the drones, what's happening there? And do you have any idea of the casualties count for the National Guard and other Saudi forces?
Okay.
And the second point, which is a bit related, the UAE has announced a drawdown from Yemen, and there's all this stuff that the Saudis will have to inherit some of those operations and missions. Do the Saudis have any sense of how to conduct mentorship of local forces, partnership? I mean, what have we seen in the past few years that gives us any indication that they will do a good job? I mean, using the UAE as base, right? Right. So I'm curious about the more like underground elements of.
Yeah. So let me start off with border. So border control in Saudi Arabia is a complicated issue. You have a separate border control force, which is under the Ministry of Defense. And then when you look at it from the outside, people assume that border control is also a mission of the Saudi National Guard, which, as I mentioned, is more or less parallel army. I don't think that's the case. I think their primary mission, at least back in the day, was internal security, not necessarily border security. But you've seen a division of labor along the southern border here where basically the Army goes in and the National Guard preserves it, and the Ministry of Defense border guards just aren't manned at a level. They don't have the equipment to do that. So the question is, how competent and capable are they? Well, when you defend a large border here, when you're in defense, you always have the disadvantage in that you have no initiative. So, you choose to mass forces one where the Houthis cross where there's least there. They take a picture, they put it on film, they say, we're in Saudi Arabia, and then they leave before there's a reaction. And I watch battle porn, on the Houthi channels all the time. And one thing I find out is normally when they show themselves overrunning a border post, you note that all the vehicles present have been burned. And so that indicates to me that they're not planning to stay. What they're doing is conducting raids, and this is, the advantage of the insurgents. So are they good? Probably not. But nobody's good at controlling their border. I mean, if you have a long border, you have problems. And again, in my time in narcotics, one of the big issues we had on the U.S.-Canadian border, the Canadian in Vancouver, where marijuana penalties were so low, they were growing this ultra-high potency pot. And in some instances, the border was literally just a ditch, and these guys would use a slingshot, just bing, sling it over. There was, what are we going to do? Put a Patriot radar battery in there? So, matter of fact, I got arrested. Well, I didn't get arrested, but I got pulled over by a border patrol and said, go back to Canada when I was playing in the Peace Park that runs along the main road between a border by its very nature is indefensible if it's a functioning border, because a border both separates and facilitates. And so whenever you convert it from an economic political construct into a military construct, you got trouble, and nobody is good at defending a border because you're spread out. So I think the Saudis in general, the performance of their land forces in force-on-force is problematic, and whenever you have to guard a fixed facility against a force that has the initiative, you're at a disadvantage, and they're at it. And their failures in lower-level leadership, their lack of development of a non-commissioned officer corps shows most clearly at the border. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but one of the major impetuses here, they want to develop a non-commissioned officer corps. And that took the United States Army the better part of 30 years. Started in 1958 on the British model. Really it was just going around. When I got to my first unit, 7th Infantry Division Light, Fort Ord, our sergeant major was pretty much a soldier. He was more like a shop foreman than a sergeant major, like a soldier shop steward. So Union guy, but we're there now. So it takes a generation. Second question was about. I'm sorry.
Can the Saudis have developed partners on the ground?
Oh yes. But I'm sorry, with Yemen, yeah. So the Saudis do not have This is a universal problem. People think special forces are just elite light infantry. Like I've seen European countries who they have 10 infantry platoons. They say, okay, who can do the most pull-ups? All right, you guys are the special forces and everybody else. And the real mission of special forces is to train and develop local security forces. The UAE has done that very well. And they've done that very well in Yemen. And I believe that I can't prove it yet, and I could be proven wrong, but I believe that they are moving, they are not completely withdrawing, but they're moving to a more classical special forces construct where there will be a UAE cadre and UAE enablers, but mostly Yemeni forces on the ground. The Saudis, I have seen no evidence that the Saudis have developed the ability to carry that out. They're still going through Hadi people, they still have vestigial Yemeni elements, and we've seen Yemeni groups and tribes flip-flopping, and Yemeni tribalism has in the end, it did for Ali Abdullah Saleh. If Ali Abdullah Saleh, the most craftiest, foxiest, duplicitous Muldoon in the world, ultimately failed to manage Yemeni tribalism, I don't see anything that gives me any confidence that the Saudis will be able to do it. And I don't think we'll be able to do it. It goes back to your point as well. So I think they're going to be very challenged.
We've got 10 minutes left now.
I'm sorry being so
5 people who are putting their hands up. So we take a couple of groups of 2. So Tom and then the gentleman in the third row first. And we'll get to you.
Yeah, Tom Morgan, I'm a researcher at the Institute. In terms of the reforms that they're trying to make, you've described, how much do you think that's been influenced by what the Emiratis have been doing, and also their performance in Yemen? As well as perhaps the Emiratis showing up in places a little bit further afield, like Eritrea. Saudis perhaps thinking,
or Libya.
Well, we'd quite like to do.
Yeah. Okay.
That.
All right.
And then
Dominic Dudley, Gulf States Newsletter. Quick question on the UAE bit in Yemen first. They said that they were planning to pull out for about a year. Do you buy that? Is that accurate or true or likely?
No, I don't think so.
My main question though is about this patrol in the Gulf, this new system that the US needs to set up, I think based in Bahrain. To what extent will the Saudis or any other Gulf countries contribute meaningfully to those patrols, or is this going to be something from outside the region?
Okay. Tom, so yeah, I think it's a big thing. I think it's just in the very nature of a large company to get pissed off when you see a smaller company or country getting all this favorable press and going, you know, these little dorks, they don't have the requirements we have. You know, we have to secure 3 fronts against an active press and do the Hajj, da-da-da-da-da. And these guys are a boutique country with a boutique armed forces, and they go and do all this stuff, and how dare they? I think that's just natural. And the reason why I say that, because I spent 30 years in the United States Army, and we feel the same way about the United States Marine Corps. So there's these jumped up little upstarts that don't have any real responsibility, and so they can position themselves. That's got to rankle. But honestly, I've never heard a Saudi officer say that. Maybe that's because I've been diplomatic enough to never raise the subject. But I think it's just human nature. So that's just my supposition. It would piss me off. Dominic, patrols in the Gulf. So you've never worked in government, I'm guessing. Okay. So if you work in government and you get a problem, you generally do not approach it and say, here's the problem, what is the optimal solution? Usually your first thought is, what have we done before that is closest to this? And you search for the nearest analog, because then there'll be a procedure, practice, things like that. So we have a long experience of leading multinational coalitions out of the naval headquarters in Bahrain. Everybody refers to, or not everybody, but it is common to refer to the naval headquarters in Bahrain as the 5th Fleet. But it has multiple flags. It is 5th Fleet is also Combined Maritime Command. And that Maritime Command is combined, has British flag officers on a daily basis in positions of command and leadership. And when Somali piracy was an issue, we formed a combined task force that included the Japanese. Pakistani Navy has commanded the combined task force piracy. So this is just another task force. As to Saudi participation, I don't know if there will be formal participation, but I can tell you there will be a participation of affinity. It is not inconceivable to me that the Saudis will say, we will conduct our own maritime operations in conjunction with, but outside of the command of, just because we don't have the command and control abilities or lack of some sort of equipment, that they focus on things like minesweeping. So I don't think it really matters whether or not they actually take part in the thing. I think they will coordinate their actions with the patrols, and that's what's important.
Okay, last 3, please be brief. Gentleman, second row from the back.
Right, hi, Charles Forrester from James.
Charles, you saw your slides, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the tree map. That didn't include the Canadian water models. That figure was mainly stuff from CAE for training simulation and lab water.
Okay.
Just a couple of comments to draw out from what we talked about here. With Sandy, one of their big things is that they're going to be doing a lot of indirect offset as well. Talking to Andreas Schwer at Paris Air Show.
Yeah.
They're going to be quite heavily focusing on aerostructures moving forward. Now, one of the things they'll be doing there also is with helicopter work, they're looking at seeing what Turkey have done and what the UAE have done and moving that forward with their own model and going forward. And that's going to be one of the key drivers for how they get their revenues coming in.
Right.
Additionally, they'll be looking at doing some offshore acquisitions, keeping that stuff offshore. So the big one will be Denel in South Africa. They'll be talking about not being able to successfully get that one. But they'll be able to do what some other countries have done and keep that stuff offshore, get the money from it, but not necessarily have the stuff come onshore and go through all the export control issues. So that's where one of the challenges they're trying to overcome that way.
Great. So I get most of my stuff from Charles and his colleagues at James. So watch that face, and you know, like I said, usually I'm not missing a whole lot from not being in the Pentagon as long as I got my subscription to Charles.
We'll forgive the promotion of James in the ISS. Just this one.
Sorry.
Gentleman, second row, and woman in front row.
Professor Des Roches, I was just thinking, so you have been there. What do you think about the evolution of professional culture within the military?
Yeah.
Is it still like royals getting into the military and getting onto the top ranks? Because we know the Saudi National Guard and Air Force, actually, the chiefs are two real brothers. So how is that culture evolving, and what's its general impact on the professionalism of the military?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the issue of meritocracy in the military is always a big one, and it's hard in all of the Gulf states. You know, you might see a prince who, you know, isn't done in. We kind of joke that when a royal goes into the military, the only true evaluation he gets is if he becomes a pilot, and it's provided by gravity. And you can look across the Gulf and you'll find a number of royal family members who have crashed very expensive aircraft, who are, you know, ambassadors or ministers or something because of that. This is a question, and honestly I don't know, because this is going to be hard. But the chances are better now than they have been in the past, because in the past, really, the Ministry of the Interior was the Army of the House of Nayef, and the National Guard was the Army of the House of Abdullah. Abdullah and his sons controlled the National Guard since 1962. You know, and then you had Sultan had the Ministry of Defense. One of the reasons why the 2011 F-15 purchase, the $60 billion F-15 purchase, took so long was because King Abdullah was trying to minimize the influence of Sultan and ensure that he didn't get a rerun of the El Yamana deal with corruption and things of that nature. And I always take the opportunity to point out that Tony Blair suppressed the Serious Fraud Squad inquiry on the El Yamana deal. Okay, so I checked that one. So I don't know that there will be a good outcome, but I'll tell you that the land is better now than it is. I mean, let's face facts. People very rarely are able to pull off the kind of reform that is called for here in a cooperative, nudging, cajoling manner. Usually it does require a little bit of coercion, and Lord knows the Saudi state is set up to deliver coercion. And I think that everything I've read and seen, this is the best chance the state has to pull off this very, very ambitious goal. But, you know, execution is everything. But they're in a better position now. I just don't know how it's going to play out. But I do think that the role of royals in Saudi Arabia is probably going to be minimized, and it'll become more like, you know, princely houses of India or something, because it's just unsustainable. It's just unsustainable. That's a guess.
Okay, last question. We're going to turn around.
I'm a senior analyst with the Arabian Foundation. Also, my father served in the National Guard in the Gulf War too. I just want to know, what's your take on the U.S. decision to send troops to Saudi Arabia? Does that mean a gradual return of the U.S. forces after 16 years? Also, will there be any resistance, like by clerics, like it used to be in the 90s?
Why are you asking me that? Why would you know, you've done me an honor. Well, you know and I know Saudi Arabia has changed. And I think this idea, you know, the Osama bin Laden idea that, oh, you know, the Americans are in the land of the Prophet. It's like, really? Dahran? You know, it's not there. So the amount of forces that we've seen, I think, are very small. It seems like it's an Air Force civil engineering squadron and then a Patriot battery. It's about 500 folks. I have long advocated, to including government, that Prince Sultan Air Base, King Khalid Military City, that we should have a constellation of air bases and facilities in the kingdom and throughout the Gulf that we keep hot. So we, you know, like maybe build a mess hall, a gymnasium, shower block, and then have concrete pads with pipes over them that we could throw tents over and run air conditioning into, and that we could step up quickly. And that, you know, every 6 months we jump the headquarters from El Udeid to El Isa Air Base in Bahrain, or to Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, or even down to Salalah in Oman, just to show we can do it. Just keep doing that. And that by doing that, that will frustrate the Iranian ability to do missiles, and it'll do some other things too. Like, for example, if we shift the headquarters, then the Iranians have to physically move some missiles, and so there's a possibility that we will determine pre-existing offensive capability that we were unaware of, because, believe it or not, we are not omniscient. So, you know, when batteries have to move around, you find out things. So I think this is a small move, but in the current environment, every person who goes into the Gulf is being trumpeted as, you know, the strength we're confronting the Iranians. I think this is a relatively small move, but with potentially big implications. I don't take it as an ominous sign of an escalation, but so far, when you look at the actual increase in U.S. presence, you know, our presence kind of goes in cycles, and that's based a lot of time on just availability of carriers going in and out of the region. we're not in the 98th percentile of the normal curve. We're in about the 70th percentile. We're well within the band of the normal here. This is well within the band of the normal.
Excellent. Dave, thanks very much indeed for a discussion of vital issues, I think in an informative, richly detailed, but also entertaining way. Hopefully you'll stay around for a couple more minutes if people want to catch up with you.
Of course,
But please join me in thanking Dave Des Roches.